Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our top 2 review series on the nation of China. Now, as an interesting aside before we get started in this video, a very long time ago I did a review on the ZTZ-99, back when it was just called the ZTZ-99. Currently it's called the ZTZ-99 Block 2, and I lamented that while it was at least a half decent tank, it didn't really have a lineup. Chinese top tier at the time consisted of the ZBD-86, the PTZ-89, and the WZ-305. Chinese air support was borderline non-existent with just the J-72, and of course China had no helicopter tech tree back at that point. I essentially observed that while the ZTZ-99 was a half decent tank, it was basically on an island and had nothing around it, and man, a lot has changed in that time frame, so let's check out how the lineup looks like now. Of course, here's just a quick reminder of the grading scale, with S being the best in category, A being very good, B being average, C being poor, and F being no suitable vehicles. If you want a more complete rundown of those categories, I would recommend watching the first video in the series where I reviewed France, because I go over a lot more in detail how I'm grading these vehicles back then. We will also be going through the vehicle types in descending order from the most important vehicle types to have in a top tier lineup to the least important. Kicking us off, as we always do, we're going to be looking at the main battle tanks for China. China currently has 3 main battle tanks that you could potentially put in a top tier lineup and would be perfectly at home here. You have the ZTZ-99A, the WZ-1001, and the VT-4A1. The strengths of these vehicles are good mobility, good ammo selection, and good frontal armor. The disadvantages are weak lateral armor and a poor reload. In terms of the mobility, there was something I had to check when I was playing the ZTZ-99 and the WZ-1001, because I was pretty confident they were some of the more agile vehicles in the game, and it turned out I was entirely correct. They have a 1500 horsepower engine and only weigh 55 tons, giving them a total power to weight ratio of over 27, which is actually better than the majority of tanks you will find in the top tier environment. These tanks are very agile and also reasonably fast, with the top speed of 75 kph forward and 33 in reverse, so their mobility could be characterized as noticeably above average. The big exception is the VT-4A1. It actually trades a lot of horsepower and about half of its reverse gears in order to get a hard kill system, which actually makes it the most sluggish of the group and the one I would generally recommend the least. The ammo selection on the tanks is actually pretty exceptional. You have a dart and a heat FS round, but those are pretty standard for basically everyone. You also get a fairly powerful high explosive round, which is handy to have if you see somebody's cupola poking over a hill. Additionally, you also get a barrel launched guided missile and also a proximity fuse shell, both of which are pretty handy for shooting down things like helicopters. While the dart for these vehicles is on the low end, it's not that powerful in terms of raw penetration. It does generally get the job done, and I would categorize this as one of the better selection of ammo for any top tier vehicle. In fact, the biggest problem is trying to figure out exactly what ammo you want to take and how much of it, given that you only have so much room. The frontal armor profile is also quite good, with the turret face and upper front plate being generally impenetrable to the vast majority of shells, and also featuring relatively small turret ring, driver's hatch, and breach, at least compared to some of the contemporary tanks. On top of that, because the ERA packages are made to blend in with the vehicle's hull, it's actually difficult to distinguish at a glance where the ERA ends and the hull armor begins, so while it does have gaps, it is often hard to see them. For all those advantages, however, the drawbacks are fairly noticeable. The lateral protection on all of these tanks is fairly weak, and you'll easily get shredded by any autocannon, even the slower firing ones. In addition, while the upper front plate is incredibly thick, the lower front plate is also very prominent, and usually a hit there will cripple the vehicle. And while the addition of the autoloader to absorb shrapnel has added some durability, they still don't have anywhere near as favorable as a damage model as their Russian contemporaries. The reload is going to be another noticeable sticking point, in that at 7.1 seconds, it's noticeably slower than basically everything you fight, especially given how many vehicles at top tier have 5 to 6 second reloads if you can ace the crew. The Chinese MBT lineup for me personally is almost a quintessential B-grade lineup. The vehicles have notable and usable strengths, but also notable and exploitable weaknesses, and this combination makes them relatively balanced vehicles that don't excel in a ton of areas, but also aren't terrible or unusable in any area either. Next up, we have the AntiAir, and the only AntiAir really of note for China for top tier is the Tor M1. The strengths of the Tor M1 are a good radar set and a fast moving and long range missile, and the weaknesses are a general lack of flexibility. The radar set on the Tor M1 is easily one of its stronger features. It features a really good scanning arc both horizontally and vertically, and additional has features such as multi-target tracking semi-automatically speed and IRST, it feels very similar to a Pantsir in this regard. The missile itself also features fairly good turning and a fairly good high speed and retains its energy reasonably well, at least compared to some contemporary missiles, so hitting targets at longer ranges with the Torum 1 isn't terribly difficult. The biggest problems of the Torum 1, lack of versatility, all spring from how its missiles are launched. The missiles are actually launched straight vertically. This vertical launch means the missiles don't go directly where you want them from the moment you fire, they have to go up and then arc into where you are currently aiming. This presents some pretty noticeable issues if you're trying to engage enemies at closer ranges, and it also severely limits its ability to engage ground targets. While it's not technically impossible for the Torum 1 to engage ground targets, the missiles have to go up and come back down, giving it a fairly substantial minimum range, so outside of some pretty niche cases, you're probably not going to be able to hit ground targets at all. Additionally, this is one of those launchers that not only do you have to stop in order to fire the missiles, but the launchers actually close while you're moving, so you have to stop, wait for the launchers to open, and then fire them, which gives it less responsiveness while moving than most other systems. That being said, it is at least not as big, heavy, and sluggish as many of the trucks around this battle rating, but that's a small point in its favor. All of these factors combined make the Torum 1 a pretty firmly B-grade anti-air. While it can engage air targets effectively, its ability to do so at closer ranges or to engage ground targets do limit it a lot, and if you'd compare this to something like the ADATs, I would say the Torum 1 is better at engaging air targets on the whole outside of some corner case situations, but is significantly worse at engaging ground targets and is probably the worst system we've seen so far at engaging ground targets. It's essentially a hyper-specialized anti-air that is useful for longer ranges. Then again, longer ranges is generally where you need anti-air at this battle rating, since if the enemy is closer, the proximity fuses you have on a lot of your vehicles can actually handle them reasonably well. And next up, we'll be looking at the light tanks for China, and China has three options. You have the ZBD-04A, the ZLT-11, and the QN-506. The QN-506 is an older event vehicle, so we're not going to touch on this too much. You might think because it's the highest battle rating out of the three that it's the best choice, but broadly speaking, it is somewhat a dopey and unreliable vehicle. The mobility is fairly poor, it has essentially no armor even compared to the other two, and the missiles tend to be somewhat unreliable. The QN-506 does have the distinction of being the very first ground vehicle in War Thunder to feature fire and forget anti-tank missiles, but other than a collector's item, it has very little use. As far as the other two light tanks, we're going to have to kind of address them separately because they are very different vehicles. The ZLT-11 as a wheeled light vehicle, its main advantage is that it does have a very significant selection of ammo types, and it doesn't really have a lot of disadvantages, at least not any that you couldn't apply to basically any wheeled light vehicle around this battle rating. It does have things like poor gun depression and poor close quarters mobility, however basically all of the other wheeled light tanks have that problem. As far as the shell selection, this is somewhat similar to the Chinese medium tanks in that the shell selection is fairly absurd. You have both a dart and a heat FS round, and the dart, while not the best, is more than capable of killing any vehicle at this battle rating. Additionally, you also have a guided missile and a proximity fuse, and also a SAPI round that has about 90 to 100 millimeters of penetration, which makes it one of the few high explosive rounds at top tier that can knock out a Russian tank through its cupola. This versatility and shell type does come at the expense of a reload that is fairly slow for a top tier vehicle. The ZBD-04A is a very quintessential IFV featuring both an autocannon and a guided missile launcher. The ZBD-04A does have a noticeable advantage over some of the other IFVs of this battle rating because its missile launcher is actually a 100mm gun missile launcher that has a fairly decent velocity out of the barrel and also has a quick reload at only about 5 seconds, and it can also lob some fairly powerful high explosive rounds as well. The only real disadvantage I would give to the ZBD-04A is the same one I would give to ZLT-11 in that both vehicles are somewhat large, however their empty space can sometimes allow them to survive hits where other vehicles that are more compact would actually be destroyed. If I were to characterize the ZBD-04A in one quick pithy comment, it would just be that it's basically a BMP-3 that doesn't completely suck. The gun has better penetration, the missile launcher has a much faster reload, and overall the mobility is generally stronger. However, one downside of the ZBD-04A is that the ZBD's missile only has about 700mm of penetration. It does have a tandem warhead, but this is still somewhat low for its battle rating and can mean you have to land some pretty precise shots on certain enemies. Overall, the selection of light vehicles available to China are fairly solid. You have a light wheeled vehicle with a good punchy cannon that can basically be used to get into positions on very big open maps, and also a lighter IFV that can be more aggressive on more confined urban maps. The biggest issue, however, with this light tank lineup is that much like a lot of the previous vehicles we've looked at for China, the strengths are balanced out by some pretty noticeable weaknesses. The ZLT-11 doesn't have a ton of survivability, and with its slow reload kind of needs to land those first shots as kill or crippling shots, whereas going to be in serious trouble, and the ZBD-04A's missile can sometimes not be adequate to take out some of the heavier opponents, especially at close range, which can leave you in an awkward position of trying to use your slow firing gun to take out barrels. Additionally, the slow firing gun on the ZBD-04, even though it does have pretty good penetration, can sometimes struggle with side ERA skirts. With all that being said, I think it's pretty fair to award a B grade to this selection of light tanks. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with the ZBD-04 or the ZLT-11, and they do a fairly good job of covering some of the weaknesses of your MBT lineup and also getting you into aircraft quickly, which is really the job of a light tank at top tier. However, they don't have any of the superlative features that really elevates them above the competition. Instead, they feel more like the exemplars of their particular category in that they basically do everything that a generic vehicle of that category would do, but don't really do anything else or do it any better. Next up, we have the helicopter lineup for China, and there are a total of 3 helicopters that I would broadly view as suitable for top tier. You have the premium Z19E, the Tech-Tree Z19, and of course the Tech-Tree Z10. There are a relatively small number of differences between these 3 vehicles, and they don't really alter the playstyle all that much. They still have, broadly speaking, the same set of strengths and weaknesses. The strengths of the Chinese helicopters are that they have excellent anti-aircraft missiles and a large inventory of them, and the weakness is that they have only a modest anti-tank capability. And hitting on the point of the strength, the Chinese helicopters feature the excellent TY-90, which is currently the best air-to-air missile available on any helicopter in the entire game, and actually by a pretty decent margin. The missile stat card may or may not be incorrect because it says the lock range is only about 4 to 6 kilometers, whereas realistically you can get locks out to as far as 7, and the missiles are so ridiculous that they can still hit targets out to that range. Additionally, the minimum load that you can carry on the 3 helicopters we mentioned is 8 TY-90s, with one of the big differences between the helicopters being the Z10 and its capacity to carry 16 TY-90s, giving it the current record in War Thunder of the aircraft that can carry the most air-to-air missiles in the game. The Tech-Tree Z19 also couples this with an air search radar that can make it especially lethal to aircraft, and the Z10 also has a backup gun that it can add to this equation as well, and those are really the only big differences that you'll see between these airframes. The anti-tank capability, or more specifically the anti-ground vehicle capability on these aircraft, is somewhat less substantial. However, the Z19E and Z19 have the Blue Arrow and AKD-9 missiles respectively, and these could be seen of as sawed-off Hellfires in that they have very similar performance characteristics to Hellfires, but they are a little weaker. The Z10 actually features the AKD-10 missiles, which are kind of super Hellfires. They have a little bit better speed, penetration, and explosive mass, but on the whole do still perform pretty similarly to Hellfires. That being said, we already touched on in the American video that Hellfires do have a number of weaknesses that are easy for enemies to exploit, or that can cause them to miss enemies even if those enemies aren't really paying attention, which can make them a little frustrating to use. And to top it off, the Chinese helicopters do only carry a whopping 8 of them. However, because of the missile's slow movement rate, you're often not firing that much more than 8 anyway in most situations, and usually if you are, you're having a pretty good game, so this doesn't hold them back as much as it does with things like spiky Rs, where the missiles are a lot less likely to one-shot opponents. The Chinese helicopters end up being some of the more peculiar helicopters in the game because having a large inventory of excellent air-to-air missiles allows them to fill a secondary role that most helicopters struggle with, and that is basically being a flying surface-to-air battery that can go around the map to awkward spots where your normal anti-air can't get to, and can take out multiple enemies with relative ease, even fast-moving jets at high altitude. That being said, the lackluster air-to-ground performance does act as a pretty effective counterbalance to this strong air-to-air performance, and winds up with these helicopters, for me at least, only getting a B grade. While they can be quite effective, the only feature that really allows them to stand out from their contemporaries in other tech trees is a feature to go up against other planes and helicopters, which doesn't really come up every map or even most of them. A lot of times you really want your helicopter to simply be picking off ground targets to help your team push the map forward more, rather than trying to take out aircraft who may not be doing that much to begin with. For the next category, we're looking at the fixed wing cast for China, and there is one really strong standout option, but also some secondary options. However, the strengths and weaknesses aren't that different. The biggest strength of China is that it can use Western style targeting equipment with Eastern Soviet style weapon systems, which makes for a pretty effective combo. However, the biggest weakness is a lack of true multi-role top tier aircraft, and we're going to look at that in a second. For the standout cast option, the JH-7A is clearly the winner. The JH-7A features KH-29 missiles from the Russian tech tree, but also couples that with a good thermal targeting pod, which allows it to outperform outperform the Russian Kh-29 carrying aircraft, in addition to also being able to carry laser-guided bombs and some Fox 2 missiles for self-defense. And on top of that, the JH-7A has actually pretty good air-to-air performance, so if you do find yourself in the rather unusual situation of having to go toe-to-toe with an enemy aircraft, the JH-7A can actually come on top quite often. Of course, the biggest drawback to the JH-7A is that it doesn't have Fox 1 or Fox 3 missiles for longer range air-to-air engagements, and this is where we start getting to one of the fundamental weaknesses of the Chinese tech tree. The F-16 MLU does feature Fox 1 missiles and also features Mavericks. However, they're only B model Mavericks and it has no targeting pod, so the targeting with the missiles can get a little awkward, and the Mavericks and the Fox 1s take up the same pylon space, so you can't carry both of them in the same loadout. So while it is a reasonably functional aircraft, it's not all that impressive, at least not at this point in the game. The J-10A can carry Fox 3 missiles along with laser guided bombs. However, guided bombs is really the only string to its bow. It doesn't have any faster moving projectiles like missiles that it can lob at the enemy, and in addition it only carries a maximum of 2 bombs, so its inventory is very limited, making it pretty unideal for ground RB. Lastly, the JF-17, or Jeff as people have started calling it, does feature a good thermal targeting pod and can carry a maximum of 6 laser guided bombs, which is pretty nice. However, you can't carry the 6 laser guided bombs and Fox 3 missiles, so at that point you're not carrying a significantly better loadout than a JH-7A. You're just carrying 6 laser guided bombs and 2 Fox 2s, which the JH-7A can already do, in addition to having the option for Kh-29s. Jeff is certainly more flexible than the other 2 airframes, although it's still not exactly what you consider a really big top tier threat. The J-8s and J-11s have essentially no guided ordnance whatsoever, so you're essentially just using unguided bombs and rockets, which makes them wholly unsuitable for top tier, and the F-5E does have some Mavericks, but at that point you might as well just use the F-16 MLU. As of right now, Chinese top tier is kind of propped up by the fact that JH-7A is such a strong ground attacker. With the ability to carry 2 Kh-29s, 4 LGBs, and 2 Fox 2 missiles, it can really do a number on the enemy team. However, it can feel a little limited, especially if the enemy decides to spawn one of the top aircraft in the game with Fox 3 missiles, as your options for engaging that enemy are going to feel pretty constrained. Conversely, taking out a plane that can deal with one of the Fox 3 carrying enemies is going to leave you with some incredibly lackluster air-to-ground loadouts that aren't really going to impress the enemy team and that can often struggle to deal with hostile anti-air. In this respect, I think it's entirely fair to give Chinese CAS a solid B grade. It is very functional, and the JH-7A is probably one of my favorite CAS aircraft user on this battle rating because it has an excellent combination of ordnance and flight performance. However, it is undeniable that there just isn't a good option for a Fox 3 missile carrier that has a suitable air-to-ground loadout. Last but not least is the tank destroyer category, and China does have one tank destroyer that I will give an honorable mention because it's remarkably functional at top tier, although it won't be the main focus of this video. The PTZ-89 has a remarkably high penetration dart at well over 400mm, along with a 5-second reload and a laser rangefinder, and also a stabilizer. The only thing it's really lacking for the top tier environment is thermals. It's also fairly sluggish and also doesn't really have any armor and can basically be 50 cal'd, but if all you're looking for is a cheap spawn to get some kills, the PTZ-89 is remarkably not bad in this role. That being said, the PTZ-89 is thoroughly overshadowed by the AFT-09 or the AFT. The pros of the AFT are fairly ridiculous and powerful missiles, a hammerhead turret, and excellent mobility. The only meaningful downside to the AFT is a fairly poor ammo load of only 12 rounds. The AFT's missiles feature 1200mm of penetration. They also feature good speed and also good maneuverability, so they're very easy to control, even at longer distances, and landing the shots you need is not that difficult. The AFT is also incredibly lightweight and incredibly fast, able to accelerate up to very high speeds and get into whatever position on the map it wants to get to use its hammerhead turret to poke over terrain. The hammerhead turret itself also features excellent depression, although it is held back a little by its traverse speed, which is fairly abysmal. Of course, the selection of only 12 rounds of ammo for a vehicle can be a little limiting, but those 12 rounds can easily equal quite a few kills given how powerful these missiles are. In the Russian top tier review, I said the Pantsir would probably be the easiest S grade of this entire reviewing process, but I kind of lied on that because the AFT is almost certainly the easiest S grade. There is no other tank destroyer that even comes close to this little thing. The AFT is basically what you'd get if you combine the excellent missiles of the Chrysanthema with the excellent mobility and platform of the Mephisto. The AFT legitimately allows the Chinese tech tree to excel on any big map with undulating hills or large rock formations that you can hide the hull behind, and even on urban maps, its incredible mobility can sometimes allow it to sneak up on enemies where other tank destroyers would struggle. That being said, the AFT is almost the perfect example of why tank destroyers are so low in terms of importance, because even though it is easily the best in class, it also is so limiting in terms of its playstyle that only certain maps or situations will allow it to truly excel, and in other situations it will feel very lackluster. It can't fire its missiles on the move at all, it can be machine gunned to death, and of course the low traverse means it's somewhat unresponsive, but on any maps where a good position exists for the AFTI, it is an excellent vehicle at racing to that position, getting there quickly, and making a general pest of itself to the enemy team. As is the tradition with these videos, we're going to go through some general thoughts on the Chinese lineup as a whole before we give it an overall grade. If you've ever had one of those nights where you've been killed by CAS multiple times in a row, a legitimate piece of therapy and also griefing that you can undertake is to first spawn a Z10 with 16 TY90s and fly to your opponent's side of the battlefield to knock down anything that tries to take off from the helipad or runway. With 16 missiles and a built-in 23mm cannon, you can actually stay on their side of the battlefield for basically the entire map without running out of ammunition. While it may not necessarily be the strongest strategy in the world, there are a lot of people who seem to have a lot of frustration about this particular aspect of the game, and I would highly recommend looking into the Chinese helicopters if one of those people is you. That being said, I'm not entirely sure your average player legitimately understands and appreciates how utterly ridiculous the AFTI is. The mobility of the vehicle combined with how ridiculous the missiles are mean you can basically play it exactly the same at any battle rating you play it at, whether it be a max down tier at its own battle rating of 9.0 or all the way up into top tier, because really nothing beats it in terms of mobility that you will commonly see, and the missiles never stop working. Additionally, the AFTI currently holds the record for the only tank destroyer that I put in a top tier lineup and the lowest battle rating vehicle that I maintain in any of my top tier lineups. To put into full context exactly how ridiculous the AFTI is, my very first experience with Spalliner equipped tanks, the T90M and the Leopard 2A7V, was one-shotting them from across the map with the AFTI with basically no trouble. In addition, whenever I need to spawn an aircraft for video content, whether it be in this video or for other videos, plane or helicopter, doesn't matter, I always first spawn the AFTI, not the light tanks, because the AFTI is ridiculously easy to just run out and get 2 to 3 quick kills in, and basically spawn in whatever you like. With those amusing tidbits aside, however, I can't realistically give China anything more than a B grade. I have seen comments to the effect that China is perhaps underrated, but I don't think that's entirely true. Most ratings don't really include China that much, or if they do, they put them squarely in the middle. Most people's bottom threes would not include China, but neither would their top threes either, and this is kind of the problem with the Chinese lineup. It's a lot of mid-grade vehicles that are perfectly functional and mesh well together, but don't really excel even in their own fields. Well, okay, don't really excel except for the AFTI. That thing is kind of nuts, but moving along. The point really is that China is unremarkable both in a very good way and also in a very bad way. The positive side of China being unremarkable is it's one of the few top tier nations that isn't missing any category. All of the categories it has works and can do their job quite well, and none of the options it has are just so comically bad that it's worth talking about. However, the flip side of that coin is they don't have a lot of options that really elevate the lineup to another level, or that have such superlative features that they really deserve talking about, outside of some fairly niche characteristics that are incredibly useful in specific situations. In that respect, I don't find Chinese top tier to be terribly overrated or underrated. It doesn't get talked about that much, and that's kind of for a reason, because there isn't that much to talk about. You can't deride it for being bad, but there's also not a lot of areas where you can praise it for being really good either. With all that being said, however, I do find the Chinese lineup is probably one of the most comfortable ones to play, because all of the vehicles can fill their intended role reasonably well, and even vehicles like the Tor M1 that may have some deficiencies are easily covered down by other vehicles, such as the helicopter's ability to engage aircraft at closer ranges, and of course the MBTs are supported very well by the light tanks, and of course the AFTI also just does its job fantastically well as well. It's just a bunch of vehicles that do their jobs pretty well but don't really get a lot of praise for it, and I can kind of appreciate that. Basically everybody gets their job but nobody gets a medal, which makes it the most communist top tier, which in retrospect is kind of appropriate. But of course, those are just my thoughts on the Chinese top tier. If you have any of your own thoughts, feel free to drop them in the comments down below. I always enjoy reading that. In addition, as far as the next vehicle, it's going to be on Israel, because that's the only tech tree that I have left that I actually have developed enough to the point where I'm comfortable doing a review on it. I am currently working on some other tech trees, although I have no idea when I'm realistically going to have enough vehicles to do a review for some of those other tech trees. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe. That always helps out the channel. As always, don't forget to choose.